Hello everyone. I am Usman Ijaz, student of Politics and International Relations. Currently, I am associated with Iran program at Institute of Regional Studies. On the behalf of IRS, I welcome all the respectable audience, respectable speakers and enlightened audience in today's conference titled Iran's Neighborhood Policy, Understanding the Prolonged East-West Approach. IRS has been discussion on the said topic, and recently today we are here. The importance to understand the Iran's latest neighborhood policy can't be ignored. This is also evident from the several developments, like Iran has almost succeeded in empowering the Assad regime in Syria. Similarly, Houthis have further advanced in the Yemen, and evolving situation of Afghanistan after the US withdrawal provides space to Iran. Lastly, the inauguration of drone factory in Tajikistan by Iran hints that Iran wants its footprints in Central Asia. Considering all these developments, today's conference is aimed at understanding the traditional and transformative phase of Iran's policy. Now, to give his introductory remarks and to further moderate the session, I would move towards Mr. Faraz Naqvi, who is leading the Iran program here at IRS. Over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Usman. I am quite grateful to all the speakers and audience to have joined us today in this international conference titled Iran's Neighborhood Policy and Understanding its Multi-Pronged East-West Approach. Basically, the idea of discussing Iran's neighborhood policy falls within the larger framework of Iran's regional and foreign policy. However, this particular conference is different in a sense that many a times various national and international scholars tend to believe that Iran's foreign policy is only directed towards its west, that is the Middle East. However, we will try to analyze and we will try to understand that Iran's policy falls within the multi-dimensional approach towards its west as well as towards its east. And it would be quite, I would say, quite faulty to say that both these policies of East and West are not linked together. They are isolated in their own sphere. However, that is not the case. We believe that Iran's regional policy, whether towards its East, towards Afghanistan, Central Asia, South Asia, and towards its West, in the Middle East, Persian Gulf, and other regions, they are all interconnected. Yet, we believe that the circumstances and modus operandi of Iran's pursuing these foreign policy objectives may be different for various reasons and for various regions. However, the ultimate objective of pursuing this foreign policy objective is the same, and that is to enhance Iranian presence within the region and to enhance Iranian role in that particular region. So this conference would elaborate upon Iran's developing policy towards its neighborhood, both in the sense of traditional Iran's foreign policy and this particular transformative phase that has been occurring at the moment. And for this, we have the list of some eminent speakers that have joined us from across the globe, particularly from Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and of course, Iran. To just give you an overview of this conference, the conference is divided into two sessions, having 3 speakers each, and they would be deliberating upon the themes which are as follows. Number 1, Iran's Persian Gulf policy, in which the pivot would be the Persian Gulf. The second one is Iran's independence relations with its neighbors. Number 3, Iran's evolving relationship with Taliban, specifically after the US withdrawal. Then Iran's role in multilateral regional organizations, for example, ECO and SCO. And then finally, Iranian role in the neighborhood through the lens of international law, the legal perspective. And to formally begin our session 1, I would like to invite our first speaker for this session by the name Dr. Abdul Rasul Divsalar. Dr. Abdul Rasul Divsalar is a political scientist working on the Middle Eastern regional security system with a specific focus on Iran. He has received his PhD in Iranian studies from University of Tehran. Currently, he is a visiting professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Higher School of Economics and International Relations in University of Catalonia in Milan, Spain, and a non-resident scholar with Middle Eastern Institute in US. Tifsalar also co-founded the Regional Security Initiative at the Middle East Directions Program in the European University Institute in 2020. Prior to this, he was a policy leader fellow at the EUI School of Transnational Governance. Between 2005 and 2019, he has worked in Iran as a senior fellow at the Institute of Middle East Strategic Studies and as well as researcher at the Defense Industries Training Institute. So I welcome Dr. Abdul Rasul Tifsalar, and I am quite grateful that he has joined us from Italy. So over to you, sir, to give us your speech and your remarks.
Thank you. Good morning and hello to everyone. And I'm so glad to be among you today. And I try to make my comments more on the Persian Gulf politics of Iran and how Iran actually think and, let's say, design its policy when it comes to the Persian Gulf region. The south of Iran, or the area which we actually call the Persian Gulf, which almost a vast area covers vast area and geography of Iran, is a major economic hub for the country. It's where Iran does over 80% of all its economies and trades from there. It has major economic interest in the region with countries like Emirates, which counts to $18 billion per year. And that actually is a major hub for all Iranian activity. So to put it another way, there is a kind of a strategic stalemate when it comes to trade and economy for Iran, which is actually force Iran to work through its southern part, which is the Persian Gulf region. And that's why, for sure, the region has a major economic and developmental, value for Iran. It's a lifeline of the country. But interestingly, at the same time, the Persian Gulf region is where Iran faces most of its enemies, or let's say adversaries. And that is in the current political system of Iran, Islamic Republic, and that is where Iran faces United States of America, and just recently, as we will discuss further, Israel. So that's a very challenging characteristic of the Persian Gulf. So having such an important economic value for the country, but at the same time, being a space that Iran constantly face with its adversary and should create and design its policies based on security patterns and security logics. That's why these two forces, I think, has caused constant shift between diplomacy and deterrence when it comes to Iran's policy in the Persian Gulf region. So on the diplomatic side, as I said, the idea is somehow forcing or shaping the Persian Gulf region, including Iran's southern provinces, like, for example, Sistan Baluchistan, like Bandar Abbas, like Kerman, and all the provinces which are having a kind of proximity to the Persian Gulf itself and the Indian Ocean, to make it as a kind of geo-economic driver of Iran. Tehran has had major plans for that, among them, for example, Mokran development plan, which was an idea to raise the importance of the region as an economic engine of the country through different projects, from north-south transit corridor to increasing, local trade with the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. And actually, that's a concept of the economic driving or turning the region into geo-economic driver still plays quite an important role, because, as I said, for example, Emirates is Iran's first trader when it comes to imports. So Iran imports almost $14 billion per year from Emirates, which makes it the biggest number one importer to Iran. So the one idea for, or one driver, major driver for Iran's policy when it comes to that part of the of its territory is about economy, and how with different projects Iran can force and build a kind of more robust economic pattern and economic approach. However, the reality is that the second element, which I explained, and I will explain more today, or the idea of deterrence and the space which creates constant rivalry of Iran with the United States, and then, of course, the Arab states, Saudi Arabia and Emirates in the south, is somehow dominating the economic logic of working of Iran's policy in the Persian Gulf. And there are some reasons for that, which I will try to explain, and based on that, try to explain that how Iranian strategy works, and how actually is the logic behind Iranian strategy is. So the first thing is that, we know that the regional security system in the Persian Gulf is a U.S. dominated security system. It's the major. It's created by the major presence. It's formed by the major presence of United States military forces, and U.S. plays the major role of a security guarantor of the GCC countries and Arab countries in the Arabian Peninsula. But at the same time, we know that the political rivalry between U.S. and Iran is not hidden to anyone. And that's why one of the main strategies of Iran is what I call it counter-exclusion strategy in the Persian Gulf. And that's about the fact that Iranians are strongly believing that they have been excluded, or there are attempts to exclude them from the regional security system in the Persian Gulf. The latest event is what we saw, the Biden's trip to the region, to Saudi Arabia and Israel, which has some elements of building a kind of a coalition, or building a kind of a network of states, even if we don't call it alliance, but at least network of like-minded states that would create a front against Iran and actually try to balance against Iran. So the logic is excluding Iran, but creating a bloc that can contain Iranian power. So this logic has led, which is not a new idea, but it's a long-lasting idea, at least decades, different projects from GCC itself to later different concepts like Arab NATO and MESA during the Trump, and then later these days, these missile and air defense alliance between Israel and Arab countries, are all having the mindset of excluding Iran from regional security systems. So one of the major strategies of Iran is exactly to countering this possibility of exclusion. So when we talk about Iranian strategy in the Persian Gulf, the first thing comes to mind, a second issue after the economic and, as I said, economic and trade driver, which many times is influenced by these security issues, is the counter-exclusion strategy. And that counter-exclusion strategy have different phases, from forcing or bringing up the costs of securitization of the region. For example, we saw it very well in the crisis in 2019 and 2020 in the Strait of Hormuz, that Iran attempted to show that if there is an insecurity for Iran, there is an insecurity for everyone. So bringing the cost of insecurity to all actors is one strategy that Iran has attempted to show that it cannot be excluded from the security system. The second policy in this area is to show the instabilities of a US-dominated system, which Iran is excluded, to show to regional actors that they cannot live normally if they exclude Iran and still continue to rely on US guarantees. And that's basically, I think, where the whole Iran's concept of 2019 and 2020s, let's say, attacks to the assets in Emirates and United and Saudi Arabia takes place, which an attempt to show that the US guarantees does not work and US commitment is less than what is imagined. So it's better to not exclude and to push forward for an inclusive security system. So as I said, one strategy is this counter-exclusion. The second strategy directly looks at the US and it does not engage with regional actors. And that is a deterrence strategy, which for Iran is quite important when it comes to the Persian Gulf. While the first strategy of counter-exclusion, the audience of that strategy are more Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and other GCC countries, sending the message that we all should build a security system. The second strategy of deterrence in the Persian Gulf is very much directed toward the United States. And the way it works is, and the logic is simple, is as simple as showing to the United States that US cannot wage a war with Iran like the type of a war it did with Iraq, which was an isolated air and land campaign. And actually, the US was able to keep air superiority, land superiority, and most importantly, the US Navy naval superiority, which was not really challenged at all by Iraq. So the concept of Iran's deterrence in the Persian Gulf is very much based on the logic of a denying US naval superiority in the Persian Gulf. That the idea is to putting out the possibility of the strike on Iran by starting the deterrence from early into the Indian Ocean, the Sea of Oman, and then went to the Persian Gulf. So the idea of creating a multi-spaces, multi-domain warfare that the US is challenged either in sea, in air, and in the land is based on the experience of the previous wars in the region that showed that when US remain unchallenged in one domain, like in the naval warfare, it can quite comfortably work in other areas too. So the Iranian approach to the deterrence when it comes to deterrence to the Persian Gulf is to challenging the US deterrence, and more importantly, apart from this long deterrence perspective, the Persian Gulf is where many incidents between US and Iran are taking place, which are acting based on the immediate deterrence of the both countries. For example, again, if you remember during the Trump period, and when the tensions over the nuclear file rise, the number of incidents between US Navy Central Command assets in the region and the Iranian Navy increases because both countries resort to immediate deterrence in show of power and pose a credit threat through the waters of the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf plays a major role when it comes to broader security files between US and Iran, in a sense that it's where many of these signaling and many of these messaging at the strategic level takes place. And in this way, it works into a kind of, let's say, deterrence logic. But the third strategy, so the first I said counter exclusion, the second was deterrence, and the third strategy is what I call Iran's actually attempt to brinkmanship or balance the threat that it receives and the threat that it can pose. So again, the Persian Gulf plays a major role when it comes to Iran's attempts to show that it can create credible threats, and it can create a kind of crisis that goes beyond its nominal geography. And that's where we again saw, for example, many of the incidents in the late 2020, in which Iran raised tension deliberately to create a kind of a escalation ladder and to convince the other parties that they should reduce the tension. So this counter, let's say, balancing of the threat is where most of Iran's brinkmanship strategy relies on into the Persian Gulf. So I bring these two lines of my thought, which I said first, the diplomacy, which is mostly based on economic and trade diplomacy, and the deterrence together. There is another political line here that needs to be investigated also, and that's Iran's political relation with most of the countries in the Persian Gulf and the GCC in particular. So as we know, Iran has always had a good relation with some countries like Oman, recently in the last decade, Qatar, and also the trade diplomacy with Emirates has always helped the UAE to keep a level of connection with Iran, while lack of these things with Saudi Arabia was one of the factors that led to the constant crisis between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So when it comes to Oman and Qatar, for example, Iran has given an importance to these countries because of their role, their political role in facilitating the strategic messaging between Iran and US. So the role of these countries, these small countries in the GCC, is very much defined based on their value that they work between diplomacy and deterrence. So the logic is that while the deterrence is in place, you need a sort of a communication line with the other side. And Oman and Qatar has always played an important role to complement Iranian strategy when it comes to a messaging between diplomacy and deterrence. So when it comes to Emirates, however, the political role of Emirates was very much linked with its economic trade. So it's a more political economic value for Iran. So my last point and a kind of a conclusion is that I think how Iran decides about its policies in the Persian Gulf is very much defined by the dynamics of threat. So threat, I think, is the major single factor that designs how Iran actually reacts and behave in the Persian Gulf. We have seen this in a number of cases, that Iran is constantly, when it comes to its neighborhood policy in the Persian Gulf, uses a threat as a major factor that designs policy and shifts and adjusts its actions and its policies based on the level of threat that the country receives. Because as I said, while it is a major economic hub for Iran, the value of the Persian Gulf for Iran is hugely securitized, and it's hugely defined based on its bigger security dynamic and a larger security dynamic and security play that Iran has with its adversaries. So having in mind, for example, just giving an example, the Israelis' recent attempt to enter into the security system of the Persian Gulf, which has happened after the normalization of Arab-Israeli normalization between UAE and Bahrain, is a major ongoing dynamic that I think will shape Iranian policies in the Persian Gulf in the next coming years. If Israelis' actions led into a direct security presence in the Persian Gulf, Iran will definitely resort to a set of policies to counter Israeli actions, and that form and that shapes the whole Iranian strategy in the Persian Gulf. I would say that Tehran is very much ready to spend from its economic and trade interest for its security matters, and that's why, because Iran is mostly the mindset in Tehran is mostly dominated by security concerns and threats that the country receives. So it always gives and usually gives more role when it comes to countering security and military threats. And that's why I would like to end up my discussion with the fact that when we start to analyze Iran's behavior or policy in the Persian Gulf, it's always important that we look at how the dynamics of threats are moving, what are Iran's limits, because Iran has limits in the Persian Gulf when it comes to designing its security policies, which I said, for example, its trade dependency in the region is one of its limits that always somehow guide Iranian security decisions in the Persian Gulf. And then this shifting between diplomacy and deterrence is very much what forms the nature of Iranian policy toward that part of the war. So I will stop here and would love to hear your feedbacks and the rest of the speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Divlasar. So you have quite comprehensively outlined Iranian policy in the Persian Gulf, while mentioning that in all of the Iranian neighborhood policy or regional policy, Persian Gulf holds the special place because of three basic reasons. Number one, it can be used by Iran as a counter exclusively measure in the regional security framework led by the US, for example, the Abraham Accords between Israel and the certain Gulf states. And secondly, you have mentioned that Iran could also use this choke point, this specific water body, to assert the cost of insecurity, that if Iran is insecure, the other region would also feel the brunt of that insecurity because of certain strategic and economic measure, as such Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf hold the specific place among the Gulf nations in the export of their oils. And then thirdly, you mentioned that Iran could also use that as the balance of threat. And we have seen that quite rightly that there have been some attacks on certain commercial ships as well as the military ships of Israeli and other countries. So this is basically the area that you have mentioned, which should be looked upon with focus on that could emerge as a new arena for regional power competition, in which Iran would definitely have the upper hand, considering Iran's proximity in that region. So we will also know more details about you in the question and answer session. For now, we would now shift towards our second speaker from Germany. His name is Mr. Sattar Jabbar Rahman, and he is the founder and CEO of European Center for Middle East Studies. He is the alumni of University of Baghdad, and he is also the researcher and consultant in socio-political and cultural structural domains, political transformation, and human rights with specific regards to Middle East. He has also served as a renowned journalist covering the Middle Eastern region for about 11 years, and he has also taught courses in Arabic philosophy, interreligious dialogue, and human rights in Baghdad for the past 5 to 6 years. So he would be speaking on the mechanism and consequences of Iranian role in the Middle East. Having said that, I would like to invite now our second speaker, Mr. Sattar. Over to you.
Thank you. أنا معاي المترجمة ست وداد. I speak today with translator Miss وداد. Okay. سعادة السفير نديم رياضي رئيس المعهد الدراسات الإسلامية في إسلام آباد المحترم.
In Islamabad.
الصديق السيد فراس نقي
Dear
ميسر
friend,
المؤتمر
the
زملائي
president,
زملاء الأعزاء
dear colleagues,
أهديكم أجمل تحية متمنيا
welcome.
لمؤتمر النجاح لنسلط الضوء على واحدة من القضايا
I wish the
المهمة
success to this conference. It
والتي
sheds
تقع
light on
ضمن
very important subject,
اهتمام مركزنا المركز الأوروبي لدراسات الشرق الأوسط.
which is one of the interests of our center, the European Center of Middle Eastern Studies.
بالتأكيد أن أي نظام سياسي يعمل على حفظ مصالح الدولة
So any political rule would play an important part in protecting the safety of the country
والبنية الفكرية التي ينطلق منها.
and the
والبناء
intellectual
الفكري
base. Okay. And the intellectual base it's issued from.
والنظام الإيراني يعمل بالأساس على حفظ مصالح الدولة الإيرانية.
So the Iranian rule is working to protect the Iranian interests.
والذي يتمثل بإعادة أمجاد الإمبراطورية الفارسية.
In trying to raise importance to the Persian historical base of the Iranian rule.
في النظام السياسي في إيران قائم على سيطرة البرجوازية البيروقراطية.
The bureaucracy of the bourgeoisie is controlling the Iranian rule,
المتمثلة بفئة رجال الدين
which is consisted of religious men
الذين يتحكمون بالدولة من خلال توظيف المشاعر الدينية
who control the country by controlling the emotions of religiously of the people
من جهة ومشاعر معاداة الغرب من جهة أخرى.
and countering the West from another side.
كما تستثمر بالاتجاه نفسه مشاعر إعادة أمجاد الإمبراطورية الفارسية.
And it's also based on its appreciation of its historical base.
يستخدم ذلك في تعميق الالتفاف حول السلطة تلك الإمبراطورية.
They use it in highlighting the importance of the Persian Empire.
لا سيما أن الإمبراطورية التي امتدت على أجزاء واسعة من الشرق الأوسط.
The empire which extended a very big part in the Middle East.
لفترات تاريخية مختلفة.
For a very long period of time.
والذي يعيد بالنسبة لفئة السلطة وبعض الأوساط المقربة منها مبرر تاريخي لإعادة تلك الأمجاد.
Which explains why they want to resurrect that power.
العقيدة الإيرانية القائمة على محاولات التدخل والتوسع ليست بالحديث.
Iran's policy, which is consisted in trying to interfere, is not new policy.
كما أنها ليست فقط مرتبطة بالوجود الغربي في المنطقة.
And it's not merely related to the West existence in the Middle East.
رغم أن هذا الوجود ساهم بتغذية تلك العقيدة.
Even though the West being in the Middle East has encouraged that policy.
ومنحها المزيد من الذرائع والمبررات لذلك.
And it gave it a reason to further extend its this interference policy.
وهي بذلك تستقطب بعض المعادين للإمبريالية والغرب.
And this policy, the Iranian policy, attracts the anti-imperialist supporters.
رغم تقاطعهم في الوقت نفسه مع العقيدة السياسية الإيرانية.
And their support for the Iranian policies, other Iranian policies.
القائمة على الدولة الدينية وولاية الفقيه.
Which consists in a religious state.
لقد كان شعار تصدير الثورة الإسلامية
encouraging a Islamic state.
شعار تبنته السلطة الجديدة في إيران أبان الثورة الإيرانية 1979.
Was very much encouraged after the 1979 revolution in Iran.
لقد ساهمت طموحات السلطة الدينية الجديدة في إيران في وقتها
the political rule back then in Iran
وطموحات السلطة الفاشية في العراق
was sustained along with the fascist power in Iran
العراق
and Iraq.
في نشوب
Yes.
حرب دامت ل8 سنوات.
To encourage a war that lasted for 8 years.
ست وداد إذا تحسين إنه يحتاج أطول الجمل لو أقصرها.
No, it's fine. It's okay.
It's fine. لغرض فهم التوسع الإيراني في المنطقة يجب فهم عوامل ذلك التوسع.
So to further understand, we have to understand why it's the extension of the Iranian interference.
التوسع الإيراني في منطقة الشرق الأوسط يقوم على 3 عوامل أساسية.
So it's based on 3 main reasons, the extension of Iranian policy.
العامل الاقتصادي
The economic level.
حيث يشكل هذا النفوذ إمكانية لتنشيط الاقتصاد الإيراني بما يوفر فرص لتسويق البضائع الإيرانية أمام العقوبات الغربية على إيران. أعيد الجملة.
I'm sorry, my internet isn't stable. Can you please repeat?
حيث يشكل هذا النفوذ إمكانية لتنشيط الاقتصاد الإيراني.
So this power can further extend the importance of the economic power of Iran.
بما يوفر فرص لتسويق البضائع الإيرانية أمام العقوبات الغربية في إيران.
Which will lead to extending
بالإضافة للحصول على استثمارات هناك
and gaining more and gaining
بالتعاون بالإضافة
and gaining more support
هناك.
economically. Yes.
بالتعاون مع الأطراف المسلحة التي تدير تلك المصالح وتحافظ عليها.
With the help with armed forces which are leading the power there.
العامل العسكري
The military aspect.
يشكل النفوذ العسكري واحد من عوامل ضمان الأمن القومي الإيراني.
The military aspect is one of the main assets which helps sustain the security of Iran.
والذي يتمثل بإمكانية تقوية الجماعات والميليشيات المسلحة.
Which helps sustain the power of militias.
التي ترتبط بإيران.
Which are related to Iran.
هذه الميليشيات تلعب دور في حفظ الأمن القومي الإيراني.
These militias play an important role in protecting the security of Iran.
على عدة أصعدة.
On many levels.
فمن جهة إنها تعمل على حماية المصالح الإيرانية في المنطقة.
From one side, it works on protecting the needs of Iran in the region.
كما أنها تشكل عامل تهديد للمصالح الغربية في المنطقة.
And it threatens the Western needs in this region as well.
في حالة تعرض إيران لأعمال عسكرية غربية.
In the case of any Western interference in Iran.
وبالتالي تشكل عامل ضغط ينذر بدخول المنطقة بحرب مفتوحة.
So it's always pushing to a threat of war in the region.
في حالة تعرض إيران لأي عدوان غربي.
In case there is any threat to the security of Iran from the West.
من جهة أخرى إذا ما تم التعامل مع تلك الفصائل العسكرية.
From the other side, if these militias were dealt with.
ستكون بعيدة عن الأراضي والمصالح الإيرانية.
It would be away from the benefit of Iran.
بالتالي فإن إيران تقوم بعملية صناعة حرب عند الجوار.
So Iran is manufacturing war in the neighborhood.
فالعراق يعد ساحة للصراع بالنيابة بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وإيران.
Can you please repeat?
فالعراق يعد ساحة للصراع بالنيابة.
So
يعني
yes, Iraq is at the time a place where there is a constant conflict either between the US or Iran.
بشكل أساسي وساحة نفوذ لكثير من القوى الإقليمية.
And a place where many other powerful units are there.
لذا ترتبط كثير من الجماعات المسلحة بإيران باعتبارها هي الذراع الضاربة.
So many militias are related to Iran because it is a very powerful force.
ومسؤولة مباشرة عن ضرب القواعد الأمريكية بالعراق.
And it's leading force in excluding the US forces from Iraq.
رغم أن هذه الجهات تعمل تحت عباءة الحشد الشعبي.
Even though it works on bringing up more people to its policy.
الحشد الشعبي تنطق مثل ما هي يعني بدون ترجمة. تحت عباءة الحشد الشعبي معروفة لنا. الذي مرتبط من الناحية القانونية بالحكومة.
Which is related to the government, essentially.
لكنه من الناحية الفعلية فصائل متفرقة لها ولاءاتها الطائفية.
But practically it is extended to different branches.
والحزبية الخاصة ولا تخضع لأي سلطة للدولة.
And it's not sustained by the government itself, but by different branches, political branches.
وهي بالأساس ولاءها للسلطات في إيران.
And it's can you please repeat?
وهي بالأساس ولاءها للسلطات في إيران.
And it's the spokesperson for these powers in Iran.
العامل السياسي.
The political level, political reason.
إن عدم الاستقرار السياسي والتدخل الغربي.
The political instability and the interference of the US in the region.
ودعمه لبعض الأنظمة بعيداً عن مبادئ الديمقراطية والحرية.
And the support of the system outside the realms of democracy.
التي ينادي بها الغرب.
Which is called by the West.
ساهم ذلك بزيادة دور إيران بالمنطقة.
Further extended the power of the Iran in the region.
كما ساهم الموقف من القضية الفلسطينية.
And the opinion about the Palestinian conflict.
إيجاد دور أكبر للجماعات المسلحة.
Further empowered the role of these militias.
كمجموعات المقاومة وحزب الله وحركة حماس.
For example, the resistance movement and Hezbollah.
والتي تفرض وجودها على السلطة بشكل من خلال العنف.
Which poses its power on the government through violence.
فمن الصعب تخيل وجود فصيل مسلح خارج السلطة.
So it's very unlikely to find a military resistance outside the government.
حتى لو كان شكل السلطة قائم على إجراء الانتخابات.
Even if the government was led by an electoral process.
لهذا السبب يلعب التدخل الإيراني في المنطقة
For this reason, the Iranian interference in the region
دورا في تعطيل تطور النمو الديمقراطي فيها.
plays a role in lightening the economic prosperity in this in Iran.
فلا يمكن لأي فصيل مسلح خارج السلطة
No military force outside the state government
أن يوجد ما لم يدخل بصراع عسكري معها.
can exist if it's not in the face of if it's not facing the state itself.
لذا فالقوى السياسية لا تمتلك خيار إلا بإشراك تلك الفصائل في السلطة.
So the only solution for the political rule is to bring up these forces in the
وهذا
political
ما
rule.
يحدث في العراق وفي لبنان.
This is happening in Iraq and in Lebanon.
بغض النظر عن النتائج التي تؤول لها نتائج الانتخابات.
Regardless of the electoral results.
إن النظام الإيراني ساعي للنفوذ والتدخل بالمنطقة.
The Iranian state, which is led by desire to interfere in the region,
والولايات المتحدة من جهة أخرى.
and the US from another side.
كلاهما يتبادلان الدور ويمنح كل منهما المبرر لوجود تدخل الآخر.
Are both exchanging the place and given reason to one's existence by the other's existence.
لذا فمن مصلحة الولايات المتحدة استمرار إيران بهذا الدور.
So for the benefit of the US, Iran would sustain its policy.
كما أن من مصلحة إيران استمرار التدخل الغربي في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وعدم حل القضايا العارقة كالقضية الفلسطينية.
And for the benefit of Iran is the existence of the Western forces and not solving a problem such as the Palestinian problem.
لذا فإن كلا الطرفين يعملان على توظيف عدم الاستقرار.
Both parts play a role in the instability in the region.
ويلعبان الدور نفسه في تغذية الفوضى.
And they both leading the unstable movement and chaos as well.
وإضعاف دور الدولة الوطنية.
And reducing the national state.
وتكريس الولاءات الطائفية والإقليمية.
And extending the power of the regional powers as well as the regional religious ones.
رغم أن التدخل الإيراني بالمنطقة اتخذ شكل الجماعات المسلحة العقائدية.
Even though the interference of Iran took part as the religious. Sorry, can you repeat?
أعيد؟
Yes.
رغم أن التدخل الإيراني بالمنطقة اتخذ شكل الجماعات المسلحة العقائدية.
Even though the interference of Iran in the region took part as the religious militias in the region.
التي ترتبط بشكل أو بآخر بولاية الفقيه.
Which is related to the state of the religious man.
والتي ترى في النظام الإيراني العمق العقائدي لها.
And it feeds on the depth of Iranians' religious force.
والنموذج السياسي الذي تسعى له.
And it sees it as the example it's aiming towards.
رغم البرغماتية السياسية المحلية التي تمارسها.
Regardless of the pragmatic policy it's leading.
بسبب اختلاف التركيبة المذهبية لدول مثل العراق وسوريا ولبنان.
Despite the differences, religious differences between Iraq and Iran and
عن ما هو في إيران.
from Iran.
إلا أن هذا التدخل لم يخدم الجماهير التي تنتمي للمذهب الشيعي.
This interference didn't work in favor of the Shia supporters in Iran.
بأي من الدول التي تدخلت فيها إيران.
And any of the states in which Iran interfered.
لا بل إن أوضاع الجماهير الشيعية في العراق ولبنان
The Shia people in Iran and Lebanon
هي أسوأ من أوضاع المنتمين للمذاهب الأخرى.
State is worse than other believers in these places.
وهذا يعود بالأساس لأن هذا التدخل يراد منه توظيف المشاعر المدنية.
Because of the states trying to control the emotional side of religion, to appeal to the emotional religious side.
بما يخدم أطماع القيادة الإيرانية.
In a way that would profit the rulers of Iran.
بإعادة أمجاد الإمبراطورية الفارسية.
And reigniting the power of the empirical Persian state.
على حساب مصالح الجماهير الشيعية المسحوقة أو الفقيرة.
In favor or in the face of the Shia people.
لهذا نعتقد بأن التدخل الإيراني في المنطقة
That's why we think that the Iran's political interference in the region
يصطدم مع المصالح الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والمستقبلية لهذه الجماهير.
counters the profits, the economic, political, and social profits of these groups in Iran.
In Iraq, في المنطقة وليس في إيران.
In the region as well, and not in Iran.
ولكنه يتماشى مع المشاعر الدينية.
But it is sustained by the appeal to religious further.
لهذا السبب ميكانيزم التدخل الإيراني أو آليات التدخل الإيراني.
That's why the mechanisms of the interference of Iran
قائمة على تغليب المشاعر الدينية على المصالح الاقتصادية والاجتماعية.
favors working on the appealing to the emotional religious side than working on the social economic points.
تلك المصالح الاقتصادية والاجتماعية
These social and economic sides
لن تكون واضحة إلا بتحريك عجلة الاقتصاد.
won't be highlighted unless there is the economic power is highlighted, the economic force is highlighted.
وظهور فرز طبقي واضح داخل هذه المناطق.
And there is a looking up the class division in these places.
هذا ما تفهمه جيدا القيادة الإيرانية.
This is what the Iranian power understands very well.
وتعمل عليه بشكل استراتيجي أساسي.
And it's working on strategically.
لهذا السبب فإنها تعطل عجلة الاقتصاد في تلك المناطق.
For this reason itself, it's leading backward this economic growth.
وتزيد من حجم الطبقات الإنتاجية الهامشية.
And it's increasing the poorer class divisions groups.
التي لا يمكن من خلالها الفرز الاجتماعي داخل المنطقة.
Which cannot help in establishing a more favorite social place.
لهذا السبب الاستراتيجية الإيرانية تقوم على 3 محاور مع بعض يعني مشتركة.
That's why it stands on 3 important strategic points.
تعطيل عجلة الاقتصاد.
leading
وجعله ضمن
backward
الإنتاج الهامشي
the economic growth, increasing
إضعاف
the okay.
إضعاف دور الدولة الوطنية
weakening the national state or government,
وشيوع السلاح خارج إطار الدولة.
and increasing the presence of military presence outside the government.
هذه العوامل تساهم باستمرار بتعميق الدور الإيراني في هذه المناطق.
These reasons increase the role, importance of interference of Iran in the region.
هذا الدور الذي يراد له أن يكون دور للتعاون ما بين الدول.
This role, which seems to be to want to increase the solidarity between countries.
لكن إيران تراه دور للنفوذ والتبعية.
But for Iran, it is its role to lead and lead the others backward.
لهذا السبب
For this reason,
فإن الميكانيزم سيبقى قائم لأنه مرتبط بشكل دوري بعملية الاقتصاد.
This mechanism would be sustained because it's related to the economic level.
فعلى سبيل المثال في العراق كبلد نفطي.
For example, in Iraq, which is
لم تسقط الدولة لأنها قائمة على موارد النفط. لم تفلس الدولة لأنها في العراق لم تفلس الدولة لأنها قائمة على النفط.
So the country did not lose its money or get broke because it's based on petrol.
لكن في لبنان أفلست الدولة لأنها غير قائمة على النفط.
But in Lebanon, there is an inflation because of the non-existence of certain things such as petrol.
إن استمرار تعطيل الاقتصاد بهذا الشكل
further
واعتماد على الموارد التصدير النفطية.
Yes, pushing back the economic level and relying on the petrol.
هو في الأساس الاستراتيجية الإيرانية في التعاون مع العراق على سبيل المثال.
Is Iran's strategy in dealing with Iraq, for example.
والتي من خلالها تستمر دور هذه الميليشيات أو الجماعات المسلحة التابعة لإيران في العراق.
This further sustains the importance and role of the militias in Iran.
لهذا السبب يمكن يعني إيجاز المداخلة في نقطتين. إنه الولايات المتحدة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لعبت دور في هذا التدخل من جهة.
The US from one side played an important role in the interference of Iran.
ولا يمكن حل مشكلة التدخل الإيراني في المنطقة ما لم أن يكون هناك إشراك لجميع الأطراف وحل شامل لكل المشاكل العالقة بالتزامات مشتركة من جميع الأطراف.
There is no way in leading and sorry, can you repeat the point?
بما يضمن مصالح الأمن القومي الإيراني معي استودات ألو I think Mr.
Sorry, my internet connection wasn't. Yes, okay. Can you please repeat? Sorry.
بما يضمن مصالح الأمن القومي الإيراني.
Which would sustain the Iranian rule.
وحل المشاكل الإقليمية الأخرى العالقة.
And-
sorry to disrupt you, sir, but you are left with 5 minutes only.
نعم ست وداد ممكن ترجمي لي؟
Sorry, can you please repeat? I didn't hear you.
Okay.
Sir, there is 5 minutes left for your speech, sir. If you could kindly conclude.
5 دقائق
أوكي.
فقط لتكمل.
اوكي انهيت المداخله. شكرا جزيلا لكم، شكرا جزيلا لاستماعكم.
Sorry, my internet connection is not.
شكرا جزيلا للست وداد المترجمه. Thank you Miss وداد. وعد. Thank you. انهي ست وعد. Okay, thank you. I'm finished. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Basically, you have been enlightened that how Iran, in your opinion, has been trying to interfere in the Middle Eastern politics through the use of oil. And then you have mentioned that to basically align the Middle Eastern security in a particular framework, there is a need that the regional countries may come together in a constructive manner by shedding their differences aside and to work towards the combined Middle Eastern security. And the basic thing to basically transform this into reality, you have mentioned that there is a need on the behalf of every regional country that they should stop interfering in other smaller states in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon, in Iraq, as you have mentioned, the elections of these particular countries. And that you have mentioned that because of such interference, although the major Middle Eastern powers are able to commence their influence in the region, but it came at the cost of smaller countries, for example, Iraq and Lebanon, that has been devastated both politically and economically because of the political turbulence and economic downfall. With this, we will now move towards our last speaker of this session. He is Dr. Ali Meherpour, and he is an international law expert in Iran. He is a graduate from Mufid University in Qom and Islamic Azad University from Tehran. He has been serving as a senior advocate and researcher of international law in Iran, and he's also been associated with various international and national consulting firms in which he advises and provides consultancy regarding the legal issues related to foreign policy of Iran and the region. And today he'll be speaking on the topic of Iranian role in West Asia, particularly in Afghanistan, through a international law perspective. So over to you, sir, Dr. Ali.
Hello, sir.
Yes, you are audible, sir. You may speak
Okay,
now.
okay. Well, the subject matter I'm speaking about is about the dispute and the challenge that Iran is having with the border river of Helmand. Since border rivers are not totally possessed, or they don't belong to a specific country on either side, the manipulation and use of these rivers is among the among the most serious, challenging subject matters among states on both sides. One of the main issues is the Helmand River that runs off from the West Mountains in Kabul for some 1,050 kilometers down to Hamun Lagoon, and it was actually negotiated since it was negotiated in 1855 in Paris Treaty. Unfortunately, the regime in Afghanistan has ever since neglected the Iranian right to use it, and the regime of manipulation and use of border rivers is quite, as everybody knows, it's among the most challenging subject matter, international challenging disputes. Talking about this topic, talking about the mentioned river, I mean the Helmand River, Afghanistan unfortunately has neglected, as I told you, and I keep repeating, has sometimes neglected the Iranian right of using and sharing the water. And this is not just about Afghanistan, but actually Iran has sometimes this kind of dispute with other neighboring countries too. The problem is that actually Afghanistan is located in the upper hand of the river, the upper side. So it sometimes refers to the first article, the first article of the international law of border rivers. Talking about the international marine laws, we have to mention that there are 3 articles. The first of which, the first title is the right of absolute territory ownership. According to this article, some part of international rivers which flow between 2 countries are mainly dominated by the country that is in the upper hand. In this matter, in this issue, I mean, talking about the Helmand River, Afghanistan is in the upper hand part of the river, so it unfortunately interferes in the subject matter and sometimes changes the direction of the river. And unfortunately, because since Iran is a desert and semi-desert country mostly, it faces really big problems and big challenges that seems sometimes really unhandleable. Nobody could do anything about it, and it causes big environmental crisis for Iran. The second article, the second title of the article, is limited territory ownership. According to this one, the countries that are in the upper hand can use the water while they are observing the other countries' marine or water right. Okay, I mean that they have to negotiate with their neighboring countries and the countries in the lower hands about how to handle the rivers and how to divide the water actually. The second article, the third one, sorry. The third one is talking about is the joint right of using international border lines. According to this one, Article 3 in the law, no country can ever decide about it, because decide about how to use a certain river, because a river, according to the third article, a border river doesn't belong to any certain countries, but it is actually shared by several countries. So those several countries have the right to decide about how to use the river. Yes, and the ways they are using could be for shipping, for producing electricity, for any other manners of use. It should be actually negotiated by all the countries on the border, right? Okay. So, according to what I've said, to sum up what I have said about Afghanistan, the dispute among Iran and Afghanistan, it belongs to Helmand, mainly about Helmand. Helmand is actually, as you know, mostly in Afghanistan, and Iran is the lower hand. In the lower hand, so Afghanistan is making problem by changing sometimes the direction or the amount of the portion that belongs to Iran, actually neglecting Iran's right of using Helmand. Okay, and Iran has brought a case about his right, its right of using the Helmand River, but the case has not been solved, unfortunately, and the case is going on and on, and. And the main problem is that Afghanistan, okay, the problem started when Afghanistan considered Helmand in the 2nd century as considered Helmand as its inner river, not a border one. It doesn't recognize it, unfortunately, as an international river. And the next problem is that Afghanistan always emphasizes on its absolute right, on its absolute right of using the Helmand River as a territory, as an absolute territory domination and ownership. Up to the year 1815, states, various states, actually, yes, sorry, up to the 1815 Vienna Congress, unfortunately, countries considered international rivers as their own territory possession. And the use of these kinds of rivers that time was considered as a right for the country where a river flowed from. The second problem, as I mentioned before, and I want to keep repeating, is that Afghanistan changes the direction of Helmand, unfortunately. Yes. And this is the easiest way of neglecting certain states' right of using an international river or a border river. Okay. increasing the number of the power plants and building more and more bans for bans on the direction of the Herman River is one of those problems that Iran has to unfortunately show a reaction that is not actually internationally held. The other problem is that Afghanistan is saving the water. Yes. The next problem is how Afghanistan is delivering the water to Iran. Although the regime, the legal regime of manipulation of the river, the Herman River, was negotiated and signed up in the year 1351 between the two countries, I mean Iran and Afghanistan. Later, the first commissionary meeting between the two countries under officials was held in September 8, 2004 in Tehran. Yes. To talk about the disputes they had ever had since centuries before. In the conference, in the commission, it was said that Iran could use this river, the Herman River, in 3 places. These 3 places or 3 points are 1, in the where the Sistan River limit is located. Okay. Okay. The second place was okay between Punjab 1 and Punjab 2. This place was assigned by the members of the conference in Tehran. In Tehran, yes. Yes, and this place is next to the base or the bed of the Herman River. Okay. The conclusion. The conclusion is that Afghanistan is since Afghanistan is in the upper east of the Herman River. Okay. It implicitly, unfortunately, implicitly has neglects Iran's right of using the Herman River, and unfortunately doesn't have a humanely and also a manly way of using the water, neglecting any other laws and regulations, international regulations, and unfortunately, it considers Afghanistan as its absolute territory possession. So Iran has to consider the case, and this subject matter is unfortunately progressing as an international dispute between the two friendly countries.
دولت ایران بنا به موقعیت جغرافیایی خود که در حوزه پایین دستی رودخانه ایران وحدت به اساس محدودیت استفاده آزاد از آبها استفاده
This is why Iran is referring to the right to the article that to the article of using to the limited use of international and border rivers and waters. Thank you for listening to me, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for your insightful remarks on basically the Iranian and Afghanistan relation. You have mentioned that the border regions between the two countries are quite important in determining their relations with each other, and they could also become the source of conflict between the two nations. With this, we are moving towards the end of our session one. Because of the connectivity issue, we are unable to take question answers for the moment, but we will be joining you all soon in session two in half an hour at 1 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time. So hope to see you all with the speakers and audience in session two. Thank you so much. Hello once again, everyone. So now we are moving towards the session two of our conference. Session one basically talks about the Iranian role in the region through political and economic as well as military or strategic means. In session two, the participants from Spain, Iran, and Belgium would be largely speaking on Iranian interdependent role or more cooperative role of Iran with the neighboring states and with the regional states. To formally begin the session, I would now move towards Ms. Mariam Mastoor, who is a research analyst in Institute of Regional Studies, Islamabad, and she will be moderating the session two. Over to you, Mariam.
Thank you, Faraz. As you have already mentioned that this is the second session of our international webinar. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Mani Mehrabi. Dr. Mani Mehrabi holds a PhD in international politics and economics. He's a senior journalist at Sputnik, the Russian news agency. He's also the international affairs analyst at United World Institute, an international independent organization. Furthermore, he's also the CEO of Caspian Economic Group. Mr. Mehrabi is also the member of the scientific board of the Institute of International Relations in Iran. He will be talking on Iran's geo-economic tilt and interdependent regional policy. So with this brief introduction, over to you, Dr. Mani.
I'm his translator, and he's listening to start. And
من باید صحبت کنم؟ خواهش میکنم.
Yes.
سلام علیکم. سلام علیکم.
hello.
برای اینکه سوء تفاهم بیشتر توی صحبتامون من مترجم استفاده میکنم که صحبت‌ها درست منتقل بشه.
He says I'm using a translator so y'all can understand much better and there won't be any problems in my speech.
Okay?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Okay. قراره که در مورد تغییر نگاه سیاست خارجی ایران صحبت کنم باهاتون.
We're going to talk about how we want to change the type of scene or, on the other hand, the type of look of people on Iran and other countries, treaties, and the way they talk and they have their go and come. the neighborhood policy.
از سال 1979 که انقلاب اسلامی شکل میگیره ایران نگاهش به مسائل بین الملل نگاه آرمانگرایانه بود.
He said that in the year 1979, when everything starts changing in Iran from the Shah's time going towards the Jumhuriyah of Islami, the Islamic Republic coming to Iran and starting, the type of scene and the way they look at everything changed and turns into idealist.
و این نگاه آرمانگرایانه تا زمان روی کار آمدن آیت الله خامنه ای ادامه داشت.
And this type of idealism comes and goes till the time that Mr. Khamenei became Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei became our political head of the country.
بعد از روی کار آمدن آیت الله خامنه ای جمهوری اسلامی ایران با حفظ آرمانهاش به سمت واقع گرایی میره.
Iran, when he comes to, Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei starts becoming who he becomes and does the stuff he does in Iran, they try to keep the idealist, but they start becoming realist on the side together, as in both systems being together by using the idealist and the realist.
در این نگاه واقع گرایانه سه دیدگاه کلی وجود داشته. نگاه به شرق، دیدگاه تعامل با غرب و سیاست همسایگی که بحث امروز ما در مورد همین سیاست همسایگی.
With this type of look that they took on and they started with, they tried to keep the neighborhood policies, and they tried using the look to the east policy, and they tried to take a different route.
سیاست نگاه به شرق تاکید داره بر تعامل با کشورهای شرقی. و سیاست تعامل با غرب هم که نمونهش برجام میده به همون مذاکرات 5+1.
At the same time that using the neighborhood policies and the look to the east policy that they're trying to keep both together, they're trying to perform the fact or try to show the fact that they can, with using the help of certain countries in the West, they're trying to pull themselves up and try to take a step on the behalf of the treaty of 5+1.
ولی اولویت دولت فعلی ایران به رهبری به ریاست جمهوری آقای آیت الله رئیسی تاکید داره بر سیاست همسایگی.
Right now, in our system, in our country, with having our with having Ayatollah Raisi as our Yes, he's trying to have the main headquarters are, he's trying to start something that starts with the fact of going and coming more with the neighborhood policy that has to do with the countries around him more than it does with other countries that aren't around him. That means with countries like our neighbors like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Turkey, these countries, Turkmenia, Armenia are the countries that he really wants to come and go with and able to start different ways of going and coming, trying to sell, trying to, on the other hand, have progress in.
ایران با قدرتی که در چند سال اخیر تو منطقه داشته از مسائل امنیتی عبور کرده و دغدغه‌هاش تبدیل شدن به دغدغه‌های اقتصادی چون مسائل امنیتی ایران در منطقه حل شده.
With the power that Iran's been having in the years, on the behalf of the countries around them, their main problems that used to be about, you can say, about them being worried for different countries, not having the and not having the main sorry for a second, I've kind of lost the word to replace it with, and you know
مسائل امنیتی مخابره‌ای بگو مسائل نظامی مسائل تروریستی مسائل داعش حل شده.
For example, Mr. Mehrabi is saying that stuff like Daesh and the problems in Afghanistan has gone away. It's not like maybe in Iraq and stuff like that in Syria. These stuff has stopped, so it's not one of their main problems anymore. They're trying to go towards the economy and trying to upgrade themselves in the level of the goings and comings with the sales of the country and then the buying of the stuff that they need to have in their country and for them to become better.
اول شما آموزش بخور. ایران میخواد با تکیه و مسائل اقتصادی وابستگی متقابل ایجاد کنه بین خودش و کشورهای همسایه‌اش.
Iran is trying to sit back on the fact of using the treaties between different countries around them by using the economy and the money or the goings and comings of people around them to try to pull themselves up a lot more, and they're trying to sit back on this fact that if they can pull themselves up in this department, they can have a different look at this neighborhood policy.
حالا بعضی از تئوریسین ها میگن که این سیاست همسایگی برای ایران جواب نخواهد.
Some theoretic people that come and give ideas about the theories that Iran is trying to plan out and do, they say that it might not answer with the neighborhood policy. They might not go through with the fact that some of these money treaties or some of these treaties on the goings and comings happening and it leading to a very good side. They think it might not give the answer it needs to give. but we're hoping on the fact that we can make these deals happen. We can start going and coming with our neighbors of Iran, because it is not only a need for this country, it's something that can happen, and we're hoping on the fact that it could happen.
دلایلشون هم اینه که کشورهای همسایه ایران اقتصاد قدرتمند ندارن و اگر هم داشته باشن ایران در اولویت همراهشون نیست.
Some of our countries that are Iran's neighborhood might not have the very good economy-wise as, you know, producing a good bit of income for their own people or other people in the countries around them. But Iran is trying to use the help of them to pull up not only its country because of the sanctions we're in and the problems we have, but to help the countries around us to make big deals at the same time as Iran can put the money into making these deals and making these deals happen. When these deals happen, most likely it can pull up all the countries at the same level. Right now, if you think about the income that can happen and the deals happening, the hope that can be in a lot of people's life and how it could be a very big change. If this change could happen, and we're hoping it will happen, we can think about a good bit of people and a good bit of realism, and all of this can really change a lot of the fate in different countries around us in this neighborhood policy.
ایران برای این مسئله راه حل پیدا کرده و راه حلش هم عضویت در سازمان‌های اقتصادی اکو، شانگهای و بریکس.
Iran has found a way.
اکو، اسکو، بریکس.
Iran has found a way and a reason into fixing this problem with using ECO, that means economic corporations of organizations, and by using the help of Shanghai Corporation Organization, SCO, and the unit of brakes. If we can use their help and the type of thinking that's behind this go and come, these treaties, the income, and all of the good things that can happen with these talkings, with these sessions, with all these go and comes, if we can fix certain stuff, it will pull up this neighborhood, because not only do we have this neighborhood policy between countries, with all of us standing together with the history Iran and other countries had, all these countries that are around us in Iran, and the history that they have and the history we have, most likely we can be the history of future.
سیاست فعلی ایران اینه که ایران قدرتمند در تعامل با همسایگان قدرتمند بشه.
The type of idea that is behind this powerful thought of Iran is that powerful Iran can become powerful with the powerful help of the countries around it.
و این مسئله میتونه اعتماد متقابل ایران و کشورهای همسایه در پی داشته باشه.
And this could bring the main trust between Iran and its neighborhood policy and the countries that are neighbors with us.
این مسئله در کنار وابستگی متقابل ایران و کشورهای همسایه‌شون میتونه یک اقتصاد در هم تنیده ایجاد کنه.
With the trust of these deals happening and all of these talkings and these meetings happening, the main reason why they happen is to pull us up all together at the same time and begin a new path for trust, and it can cause a better bond between the countries and this neighborhood policy.
به طور خلاصه بخوام جمع‌بندی کنم، ایران در دولت جدیدش سرمایه‌گذاری ویژه‌ای روی همسایه‌هاش خواهد کرد و این مسئله به رشد و ارتقاء کل منطقه کمک می‌کنه.
And this new type of
Dr. Mehrabi, 2 more minutes because we have another presentation.
in this path that Iran is taking, he wants to summarize it and turn it into that same 2 minutes, as he said himself, that Iran and the new path it's taking is a path that will try to put in the most in the countries around it because of not only its own benefits, but because of the benefits of those countries itself, and it has a better bond, a better trust, a better statement, and it can happen if we all pitch in and help each other on this happening, and it would be better for all the countries together.
صحبت من تموم شد. اگه سوال خاصی هست من
He says that his speech has finished. If I myself wasn't a very good translator, I'm sorry. It's my first time. And he said, if there's any questions, I am here to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehrabi, for your presentation. And we really appreciate that you have arranged a translator for us for our better understanding. And we look forward to more cooperation from you in the future as well. You have rightly said that regional cooperation is really important in order to have regional peace over here. So with that, we will move on to our next speaker, Dr. Anna Belen-Souaj. She is going to speak on political and economic role of Iran in Afghanistan. Before I invite her, I will introduce her. Dr. Souaj is currently serving as a senior researcher at University of Granada. She is a former professor. Dr. Mehrabi, can you please mute yourself? Can you please mute it? Thank you. Dr. Souaj is currently serving as a senior researcher at University of Granada. She is a former professor of politics of the Middle East at Suffolk University. She also serves as a senior analyst in Wikistat's analytical community. Dr. Souaj holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies. She has studied and worked in several Western European and Arab countries and is fluent in Spanish, English, Arabic, and French. Dr. Souaj has published multiple articles, book reviews, and book chapters on issues related to political Islam, both in the Muslim world and in the West, and international relations with a focus on the Middle East. In addition, she is a member of the editorial board of Politics, Religion, and Ideology, and Religion Compass. So with that, over to you, Dr. Souaj.
Thank you, Mariam. Good morning or good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to be talking about Iran's role in Afghanistan. And sorry, it's a bank holiday here today, so I'm home and my cats may be making some unscheduled appearances. So I'm going to move on to the presentation I've prepared to help me stick to the issues and focus on the main points. So starting with Iran's aims in Afghanistan, well, of course, maintain its influence. Iran is a regional power, and traditionally the two countries have been close. They have close cultural ties. Dari, which is a variant of Farsi, is the lingua franca in Afghanistan. It also wants to control the flow of refugees and drugs because these two elements are destabilizing for Iran. It wishes to secure supply of water from Afghanistan's western rivers, notably the Helmand River, as we saw, as explained by Mr. Mahatpur earlier. It also wishes to prevent Afghanistan from turning into an anti-Shia stronghold, and I'll come back to this point. And finally, to balance Pakistan, which is its main competitor when it comes to influence on Afghanistan. So in order to achieve these aims, Iran pursues a double strategy. On the one hand, through alliances with minority groups. There is this religious ideological alliance with the Hazaras, who are a Shiite group. So there is that religious cultural affinity. Also the Hazaras speak Dari, or a version of Farsi anyway. And there is also political military alliances with non-Shia groups, notably the Northern Alliance in the 1990s. So it was this coalition of groups that were opposed to the Taliban, and they were mainly Tajiks. But also Iran uses money. It invests in Afghanistan, it trades with Afghanistan, and it also sends aid. So it has become the main exporter to Afghanistan, which is significant given the sanctions Iran is under. And also it is a significant investor in the Herat region. And we can see an example of that on the right. That is an annual expo held in Herat with exhibitors from both countries. Now, when it comes to relations with the current regime, let's start with a brief historical overview. Well, relations were bad, as we all know, for ideological reasons, and also because the Taliban was supported by Iran's two main regional rivals, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And then in 1998, there was an incident, or well, the Taliban overran Mazar-e-Sharif, which was the provisional capital of the Northern Alliance, and they massacred thousands of people, and they killed 11 Iranians in the consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif. So this led to Iran sending troops to the border, and finally the UN intervened and mediated and was able to defuse the situation. So given these tensions with the Taliban, Iran assisted the US in the invasion after 9/11. It provided intelligence and proxy support to the invading forces, and it also helped build a national unity government, because many of the warlords opposed to the Taliban were based in Iran. So Iran prompted them to take part in the National Unity Conference to rebuild the country and come up with a united government. However, things started to change very soon because, well, in 2002, so very, very early after the invasion, Iran was designated as part of the axis of evil. So it started to fear an invasion, a US invasion from Afghanistan. And then the Taliban and the Saudis experienced a kind of fallout in 2009 because the Saudis were pressing the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghan government, and the Taliban were not willing to do it. And they were also unwilling to forsake their ties to Al-Qaeda. So this led to limited Iranian support to the Taliban insurgency, so especially in the form of IEDs. Then in 2015, we saw the emergence of the Islamic State in Khorasan province, which of course is a threat to Iran. And this led to high-level contacts between Iran and the Taliban. So we see that Iran was playing a double game in Afghanistan. On the one hand, it good relations with the Kabul government and supported development efforts there. On the other hand, it was the Republican Guards were supplying arms to the Taliban. It was very limited support. It was just enough to keep the Western troops busy. But still, it led to a double balancing act. On the one hand, between Iran's Afghan allies, so the Kabul government and also its traditional allies. That's on the one hand, on the other hand with the Taliban, but also between the different Taliban factions. Because as we know, the Taliban are not a monolith. There are at least 3 different factions, and only one of them is favorable or more open to relations with the Taliban, the one led by Abdul Ghani Baradar. There are 2 factions led by the son of Mullah Omar and the son of the founder of the Haqqani network, and these 2 are still very hostile to Iran. But in any case, Iran is interested in having a stable government in Afghanistan. So that led it to prompt talks between the Taliban and the Kabul government when it became clear that the Western troops were going to retreat from the country, and the Taliban were very close to taking over the government again. So this was parallel to the talks taking place in Qatar, in Doha. And well, we know that the Taliban were actually, they wanted to appear as if they were willing to give peace a chance, but in reality, they didn't, as we know. And the aim of Iran here was to reach a power sharing agreement for the period after the Western withdrawal. And then after the takeover, Iran has been part of efforts by Afghanistan neighbors plus Russia to support Afghanistan's unity and sovereignty, and also for the formation of an all-inclusive government in Afghanistan, because the Taliban, well, currently the government is all male, all Taliban, and almost all Pashtun. So these countries, these neighbors of Afghanistan, want to see a stable government in the country. But in reality, as some of the previous speakers were saying, Iran follows a pragmatic foreign policy. So after the takeover by the Taliban, we can talk of the triumph of realpolitik in relations with the Taliban. So Iran was one of the few countries to keep its embassy open in Kabul. Shortly after the takeover, the first foreign delegation to Kabul was from Iran, and it was to discuss trade. And in January this year, sorry, that should have been October 2021, the previous point. So in January this year, Tehran hosted a delegation from Afghanistan, from the Taliban government. And the acting Taliban foreign minister, Amir Khan Muttaqi, also met with Afghan opposition leaders in Tehran. And Ismail Khan, who is a long-term leader of the Northern Alliance, and Ahmad Massoud, who is the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the former leader of the Northern Alliance. So this is as part of these attempts by Iran to prompt the creation of a more inclusive government in Afghanistan. And in Iran, in April this year, Iran acknowledged the presence of Taliban diplomats at the Afghan embassy in Tehran. Iran insisted that this didn't mean recognition, that recognition would only come after an inclusive government was formed. But still, it's another show of pragmatism by Iran. So what's in it for the Taliban? Why is it now willing to engage with Iran? So, well, first, to break international isolation, investment and foreign capital. Also, because now they want to appear more moderate. They want to appear as a nationwide movement And we see an example of that with the tweet on the right. So that is a Hazara politician. Let me just check the name. So, well, I think it's there. So that's Jafar Mahdavi, who is a Hazara leader. And he's one of the Hazaras who've been trying to talk to the Taliban to protect minority rights and to secure a place in the government. And we see him there sitting with the Taliban. So this would have been unthinkable under the first Taliban regime back in the 90s. And another incentive for the Taliban is to diversify their external backers. As we saw, the relation with Saudi Arabia has been on shaky grounds of late. And also there's been tensions with Pakistan due to increased cross-border attacks by the Pakistani Taliban, who are acting from from Afghanistan, and they've been attacking positions in Pakistan. So this has led to an escalation of tensions between the two sides. Now, for the sake of completeness, I'm going to mention Liwa Fatamin. This is a militia, a Shiite militia created to fight in Syria, ostensibly to protect the Shiite sites in Syria, like Saida Zainab near Damascus. And it is mainly made up by Afghan refugees. So 10 to 15 men who are now battle-hardened, so experienced. And there's been speculation that they could be redeployed in Afghanistan against the Islamic State in Khorasan province. This appears unlikely that they would be able, that Iran would be able to do this without the agreement of the Taliban, which is not very likely. But this has been, in case you come across this group, so these are Liwa Fatimiyun. Now I'm going to finish this presentation with three pending issues between the two countries. The first one is refugees. Iran is hosting over 3 million Afghan refugees who have been crossing the border for decades as a consequence of all the crises in Afghanistan. So Tehran is keen for the Taliban to contain the flow of refugees. But also these refugees, they put pressure on Iran's job market, on the health service, and this has led to resentment among some sectors of the Iranian population. So in April this year, there were incidents after there were videos circulating online of Iranians attacking Afghan refugees in different Iranian cities. And this led to to Afghan demonstrations and attacks with rocks against the embassy, the Iranian embassy in Kabul, and also the consulate in Herat, which led to Iran withdrawing diplomatic representation for a couple of weeks. So these incidents are symptomatic of how these tensions could escalate. Second issue is access to water. So one of the previous speakers has dealt with this issue. So there is, the main problem here is the Helmand River. Last year, the Kamal Khan Dam was open, and Ashraf Ghani, when he inaugurated the then president, when he inaugurated the dam, he mentioned that Iran would have to pay a toll for the water. So of course, Iran didn't like this. Also because this water is vital for the Hamun wetlands in Sistan and Baluchistan, which is a region that has seen sectarian tensions. In fact, a low intensity Sunni insurgency by Baloch groups. The final pending issue that the two countries would have to deal with is smuggling. Of course, opium smuggling. Iran is a key transit route, but also a market. There is a significant addiction, sorry, typo there, addiction problem in Iran. There's been thousands of Iranian security forces killed or injured in the last few decades, trying to stem the flow of opium and heroin from Afghanistan. But there's also other issues. There's also the smuggling of fuel. In December last year, there was a fuel smuggling incident that left also, again, several people dead. And both sides were keen to defuse and to minimize the incident. They spoke of a misunderstanding. But again, we see how these issues could escalate and get out of hand if they're not dealt with. So this is the end of my presentation. I didn't want to go over my time. Maybe it was too brief. So maybe you'd like to ask some questions or ask me to go over something again.
Thank you, Dr. Swaj. Now we will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Marian Duris. Actually, he just texted us in the morning. He had an emergency and he was in hospital. And we will request, but he has sent his speech to us. So I will request my colleague, Ms. Larave, to read the speech. But before I request her, I will introduce him for the audience. Mr. Marian Duris is a foreign policy expert with experience in international relations and security sphere in the United Kingdom, and foreign policy advisor to member of the European Parliament. He monitors the current affairs to predict trends, legislation, processes of EU, initiatives of the European Commission, background activities that affect the sovereignty of countries, and current affairs to predict bigger geopolitical trends. Over to you, Larry.
Thank you, Ms. Mariam. I will begin with the topic that was assigned to Marian Duris. It's Iran cooperation with multilateral organization from a European point of view. We are of the view that connectivity plays a key role in trade, economic growth, and sustainable development, enhances regional cooperation, and fosters friendly relations between neighboring states. In this regard, we highlight the important role of regional organizations in enhancing inter- and intra-regional connectivity. These words were spoken by Iran's Deputy Permanent United Nations Representative Zahra Ershadi, describing her country's geoeconomic role in the integrating Eurasia. These words are significant since they confirm that Iran is keen to fulfill its destiny by more closely connecting the continents through the North-South Transport Corridor, or NSTC, the flagship geoeconomic movement between itself, Russia Federation, India, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, and the countries of Central Asia. The transatlantic sanctions against Russia and its subject imposed in response to the war in Ukraine helped to speed up the transformation of relations by making Iran necessary to that targeted power. Reserve Bank of India internationalized the rupee by creating a system for using it in trade with the Central Asia, Iran, Russia, and South Asia. All of this came in the run-up to Russian leaders' discussion with his counterparts from Iran and Turkey, directly in Tehran. And during this time, he was also expected to meet with the President Ibrahim to discuss the NSTC more at length. It looks so that Iran has found itself playing a unique role in this transition due to its position that imbues it with disproportionate geoeconomic influence in shaping the new economic form of Eurasia and its relations with other parts of the world. The next subtopic of his speech is Iran's mission in BRICS Plus. It is similarly irreplaceable due to the powers like Russia, China, and India converging connectivity interests exactly in this location, with huge but still not fully tapped potential at the continental crossroads of Africa and Eurasia. Iranian president was invited to attend the high-level dialogue on global cooperation and BRICS Plus summits, where he praised many new multilateral platforms and pledged to support these initiatives. This country is optimized partner for the multiple reasons, including converging in trust or cooperating through the NSTC, which can be seen as life-giving highway. Although transatlantic powers tries to isolate, divide, and sanction subjects participating in these projects, If we watch the Chinese-Iranian cooperation, these countries signed a 25-year strategic partnership pact in spring 2021. Moreover, Iran is one of the anchors of the significant China-Central Asia-West Asia economic corridor to Europe. This project has become alternative and more important after the sanctioning of Russia. In the light of these facts and geopolitical rivalry, BRICS Plus and participation of Iran look like the effective platform for connectivity interest of Eurasian powers and its partners. And when these common interests converging exactly in Iran, it's only a matter of time when the multilateral cooperation will work fully and officially. Iran's inclusion in BRICS Plus transformed the organization as a whole into higher level of cooperation and sophistication of countries which do not prefer external pressure or empty promises, but only mutual benefit. On the other side, from the wider BRICS can lead into aggregation of the regional integration blocks of all current members, while Iran isn't a member of any of those and can fill the gap of representation of West Asia. The full membership of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. This is an important development which shows Iran's significance in moving the centers of power and their dispersion to several regions. Iran can now further enhance its ties with the members of bloc, especially Russia, China, and Pakistan. They can also work more closely together to tackle shared threats, and another point to pay attention to how this could improve Iran's prospects with Eurasia and how long it will take that full membership will benefit of security and economy. SCO membership as factor of the region and power balance can consider Iran as crucial part in sitting in the center of these changes. Geostrategic location enables this Eastern organization to expand to West Asia, and Iran can play an important role in motivating other countries to join this bloc. Same as Iranian membership might affect this relation with Saudi Arabia, which just moderated their policies towards the Republic, which of course influenced the regional balance. We can say that connectivity unlocks additional opportunities and can directly improve people's lives by time. Analyzing the membership as step which can reduce the impact of sanctions, it will take time. But cultivating a reliable network of partners is the first step towards this goal. Second factor can be reconsideration of own policies by partners who voluntarily compile with the USS unilateral sanctions regime in order to avoid the so-called secondary type of sanctions. But practices like these are not expected from the most of members. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has not yet grown to the point of creating its own alternative institutions, but it might eventually do so, or sometime considering the complexities. As we heard in the March 2021, and Iran and China signed a 25-year strategic agreement as part of Belt and Road Initiative. This document was signed by Iran's Foreign Minister Javed Zarif and his Chinese counterpart Wang Li in a ceremony in Tehran attended by top officials. The agreement aims to foster economic cooperation and paves the way for participation in the Belt and Road, a massive infrastructure project stretching from East Asia to Europe, with a focus on the private sector. A joint statement issued after signing said that the two sides aim to promote the development and comprehensive strategic partnership through this deal. The $400 billion deal had been on anvil since January 2016, when Chinese President Xi Jinping became the first leader to visit Iran following the signing of the 2050 nuclear accord between Iran and world powers. In June 2020, 4 years after the proposal was first pitched, the Iranian government said the agreement is based on a win-win approach, although the deal had also come under the shadow of sanctions. Generally, Iran's role as the core of many significant projects means that many powers have to take it into account when coordinating their strategies. Strategic geographic location at the intersections of Central, West, and South Asia, the South Caucasus, and the Eastern Europe contains the unprecedented potential for it to be the center of gravity of multipolar initiatives. Belt and Road as East-West vector, NSTC as North-South path, discussions on St. Petersburg Economic Forum, SCO, BRICS Plus, and the progress on negotiating free trade pacts. coupled with growing trade ties with China and thus also Central Asia due to corridor that they're jointly pioneering through that region, it is clear that Iran can be poised for an economic boom in the coming future. The analysis was named as Iran's cooperation with multilateral organization from a European viewpoint. But it should be noted that the view of Europe, its analysts, politicians, or advisors is not uniform. Yes, opinions and standards view prevailing in the main media, analytical and political surroundings are not very diverse, often with base of ideological background, financial background, transatlantic or European think tanks, foundations, environment, and various external influencers. For example, some countries in last years dismissed the chance to keep the dialogue with European Union commissioners with argument of excessive influence of United States on the recent European Union foreign policy. But if we say about this analysis, it should not be perceived as usual or standard. There are some points which he has presented. The first being the world is dealing with huge amount of challenges, so it is important to have a chance to end certain conflicts. World can be safer place if some countries could rebuild its ties with Iran. Second, there should be framework for boosting economic ties, at least on bilateral basis. For example, in agriculture, food industry, water management, health, developing intercompany cooperation, energy industry, or hydrocarbons, with efforts to neutralize sanctions which are not contributing to beneficial relations and economic performance. Third, bilateral basis can be beneficial even for participation in multilateral organizations, as we discussed before. For example, Slovakia, with its strategic location, was among the first countries to sign the memorandum with China on Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. Some experts and officials saw potential that a new transport corridor from China entering eastern Slovakia could be opened and serve as an alternative option to the northern route. The revival of these efforts, at least for Slovakia, in case of patriotic government arrival, could bring a positive transition from unilateral to a multilateral foreign policy, which in crisis times could mean greater security in more areas. Number fourth, Iran can be taken as crucial bastion against migration, which comes from Afghan territory and surroundings. Reason is simple. Migration is illegal and mass version is not accepted by vast majority of population. Final summary. Iran uses its strategic location for its own economic and geopolitical benefit to a greater extent than in previous periods. Many projects in which Iran participates today or will participate in the future bring not only short-term but especially medium and long-term positives. From the point of view of an independent observer and analyst, there's still room for improving managerial and institutional processes in the context of adopting to a new geopolitical trends. We can say about phenomenon affecting apparently every country in the world. Many of them, often under external influence, cannot resist this pressure and they adapt to it at the expense of the quality of life and own internal systematic stability. We can therefore assess positively that our today example has realized the importance of its position, continual rise of multilateralism, importance in foreign affairs, and through the exercise of its own sovereignty, it is able to change into practice. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ms. Mariam.
Thank you, Larry, for reading out the speech. Now we will move on to our Q&A session. First, before taking the first question, I would like to tell you that Dr. Mehrabi has left. He had to go somewhere. We were really looking forward to have him for the Q&A. But we have Dr. Swaj with us, so all questions will be directed to her. So I have received two questions from Syed Imran Sardar. He is a research analyst at IRS. He wants to know that the question is directed to you, Dr. Swaj. He wants to know that, do you think Iran's nuclear program is just an excuse? In reality, West, particularly the US, wants to isolate Iran systematically and to curtail its influence in the Middle East? So your take on that.
Well, I believe that the nuclear deal has been used to isolate Iran. It doesn't mean that the Iranian nuclear program is not a concern for the countries of the region and the international community at large. But it is true that there was a perfectly viable functioning agreement in place, and this was undermined by, well, the Trump administration. And now it's going to be very hard to go back to something similar to it. So it's very unfortunate that the nuclear deal was sabotaged.
Okay, he also wants to know, there is another question, that it's been said that US policy towards Iran is mainly driven by Israeli lobby. So do you think that perception is correct?
To some extent, yeah, to a large extent, let's say, because Israel is the United States' main ally in the region, and Israel perceives Iran as the main threat. So, of course, the Israeli lobby has great influence in the US, and it's one of the main reasons why we don't have a nuclear deal anymore, going back to the previous question. So it's not exclusively the Israeli lobby, there are other interests, but without a doubt, Israel plays an outsized role in US foreign policy, especially regarding the Middle East and relations with Iran. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have some justification to feel threatened by Iran. It is, I mean, from my perspective, Israel should try to get to achieve a fair peace deal with the Palestinians to diffuse tensions in the region. But failing that, of course, Israel feels threatened by Iran because it's the only country in the region that actually wants to do something about the Palestinian issue.
Thank you, Dr. So as the last question, I would really like to know that recently President Ibrahim Raisi has said that US sanctions on Iran are harmful for world economy. So how does Europe looks at that step?
Well, I agree, again, to some extent, because there is no doubt that if Iranian oil was in the world market in the quantities Iran would be able to produce in normal circumstances. So if that were the case, energy prices wouldn't be this high. And also Iran is a large country with a young educated population. It's a very interesting market. So it would be very good for Iran to be part of the international market. Now, it doesn't mean that Ibrahim Raisi, Prime Minister Raisi, President Raisi, sorry, and the Iranian regime couldn't do more to make that possible. They could, but it would be desirable for all, I think, and from the European perspective, to have Iran as an integral part of the international community and the world market.
Thank you, Dr. Swaj. I think we should move on to the conclusion. The conclusion, our president of the Institute, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, is going to conclude the session. Over to you, sir. Sir, are you there?
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. It's really a pleasure listening to all of you, and my apologies that we had some internet difficulties, and because of which, some of the presentations were not fully heard to by from my side. But anyway, I was able to get the gist of what the conversation was. It was, in my opinion, it was a pretty fascinating seminar, because we got to hear the different views and ideas of different subjects. And right at the very outset, I would like to thank Dr. Abdul Rasool, Dr. Ali Meherpour, Dr. Mani, Dr. Anna, and then Mr. Sattar Jabbar and Mr. Marian. Iran is a key country. It's located at a very important place. And I think it really has no option but to interact both with the East and the West. It's a country which has lived under sanctions for a pretty long period of time. It's a country which is resilient. It's a country which, despite the sanctions, has moved along in its quest for economic development, development of some of its programs, which have been controversial, like, people have been talking about them. But I think it is a state which has a key stake in the region, both towards the Middle East and then towards Afghanistan, Pakistan, and to the Central Asian republics. Its strategic location remains, while it is an asset, it also remains a challenge because it has to overcome the difficulties which it has with some countries in the Middle East. It has to deal with Israel, and at the same time, it has to also deal with the international economic environment in which energy, after as the Ukraine conflict goes along, it has become a very important source. So with an unstable Afghanistan, with the Taliban there, they still have not been able to get recognition. So I think the way forward for Iran is to basically balance its relations and to strive for its objectives in the Middle East, as well as to improve its relations with the Central Asian republics, maybe strengthen its ties with Pakistan, and look more for energy, its supply. So I think that is the path which is forward. It can very easily use its strategic location for economic benefits, which will not only bring benefits to Iran, but also it will be beneficial for other countries of the region. With this, I would like to thank all of you for a very patient listening. I would like to thank all the speakers for finding time, because they are in different time zones. And I would also like to thank the team at IRS, Faraz, Mariam, Lareb, everybody else who have participated in this particular webinar for their efforts to making it successful. Thank you very much. And I was really, I was looking forward to this particular seminar. And I think I have learned a lot from all the honorable speakers. Thank you all. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. And now we have reached to the end of the discussion. Thank you once again. Goodbye.